You are on teams. You likely lead teams. And you know that not all teams are created or succeed equally. If you would like to understand how to unlock greater success for your teams and for groups, first of all, I'm guessing you'd like to do that. And if you would, you're in exactly the right place. You're going to love this episode. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively, make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast in the future, you could join us live to be a part of this sooner, to have more of an impact on it, and again, mostly to get the information sooner. To find out how and when and where we do that, you can join us on our LinkedIn or Facebook pages, two of the places where we stream these episodes live. You can learn more by going to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Do that to get the inside scoop and to join us in the future. Today's episode is brought to you by my latest book, Flexible Leadership, Navigate Uncertainty and Lead with Confidence. It's time to realize that styles can get in our way and that following our strengths might not always be the best approach. In a world that is more complex and uncertain than ever, leaders need a new perspective, a new set of tools in order to create the great results that organizations and teams want and need. And that's where flexible leadership comes in. It can provide those things to you. Learn more. Order your copy now at remarkablepodcast.com/flexible. And with that, it's time for me to bring in my guest. If you're with me live or watching the video, here he is. Let me introduce him to you, and then we'll get started. Colin Fisher is, well, it's Dr. Colin M. Fisher, to be appropriate and honest. He has been a professional jazz trumpet player, and because of that, he's always been fascinated by group dynamics. As an associate professor of organizations and innovation at University College London's School of Management, his research has uncovered the hidden processes of helping groups and teams in situations requiring creativity, improvisation, and complex decision-making. He's written about group dynamics in both popular science and management audiences. His work has been profiled in prominent media outlets such as the BBC, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, NPR, and The Times, and now in his great new book, The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Teams. Here it is. My copy is not the official one because I have one that came out before the book came out, which as of this conversation was a week ago. Colin, thanks for joining us and thanks for writing a great book.
Thanks so much for having me and for that fantastic intro, Kevin.
Well, even though I bobbled it earlier, and that's only because before we came online, I said, about twice a year I will bobble the intro. And so I put that in my head, I suppose.
Jinxed you. Yeah.
So let's start here. You've been playing the trumpet and been interested in jazz for a long time. You talk a little bit about that in the book. But I'm guessing that even though you early on really wanted to understand a lot about group processes and group stuff, you probably didn't necessarily, when you were, 10, 12 years old, expect you to be doing what you're doing today. So just tell us, beyond the jazz piece, like what sort of leads you, what's the journey that gets you to us having this conversation?
Yeah, it's the typical story, right? You go to music conservatory and then you become a business school professor after that, right?
Well, okay. Yeah. If it's going to be that obvious, and we're going to follow the cliche, then maybe we should just go.
Right. It's a funny journey because obviously not that many people have heard of organizational behavior when they're 10, 12 years old, unless you're, close with a parent or loved one who is into that. So as you were saying, I was a jazz musician. I had just finished music conservatory in Boston. So I went to New England Conservatory in Boston. And then, like all good aspiring jazz musicians, I moved down to New York City, tried to kind of make it in the Big Apple there. And as I was doing that, I found this program at NYU that was called individualized study. So you basically get to make up whatever master's degree you want to make up. And I decided to study improvisation across different art forms and kind of compare them because I really was fascinated with this idea of how it is that people can spontaneously come up with something that they've never thought of before. And that as I was doing my master's thesis research, I came across the work of a woman named Teresa Amabile, who was studying the social psychology of creativity. And I thought, oh, this is pretty interesting. And I was a studious guy that I was thinking about PhDs, and so I looked her up, and it turned out she was in this field called organizational behavior and teaching at Harvard Business School. And so I said, hey, I want to understand the conditions that allow teams to improvise creatively. And to my everlasting surprise, she thought that was a good idea too, and that was something that was worth studying, and I was a good person to study it with. So we started working together on that, and from there, the rest is history.
Leading us all the way to the book, The
Yeah,
Collective Edge. What would you say, Colin, is the big idea of the book?
the big idea is we need groups. They're all around us. We group dynamics are influencing every part of our lives, even when there's no group there. They're in our heads, affecting what we say and what we do. But we ignore them, and that we're just kind of pushed around by group dynamics, kind of like it's this invisible wind. And we focus a lot on how to change ourselves. We sometimes, if you're in the business world, you may see a lot of books on strategy for your whole organization, but we kind of skip over this group level. We don't think nearly as much about how do we get the most out of our groups and teams, what's so special about them, and why they're different than managing individuals or managing whole organizations.
So I have a question that I don't know, maybe no one's asked you this, or I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
hope so.
curious because most books written about this kind of thing, if there's a word in the subtitle, the word in the subtitle is going to be team or
Mhm.
teams, and you use the word groups. So how are they the same or different, and why did you choose groups rather than teams?
So I think teams, are the groupiest group, right? They're the kind of like platonic ideal of the most groupy thing you can be, where you have these, small sets of interdependent people working together towards a collective goal. And so teams, I do think have a very specific meaning, and they are, like I said, the sort of best kind of group to be in if you what you want is to get work done. But what I wanted to tell the story of wasn't just the story of real teams, which I think people usually associate with work teams or with, sports teams or things like that. But I also wanted to tell the story of how group dynamics is affecting your life at home, how it's helping us to understand politics and what's going on at the highest levels of government, how it's affecting basically almost everything. And so I am, primarily I am a researcher who studies teams for the most part, but I wanted to kind of bring the science of teams and take it just out of the kind of boardrooms and project management world, and to kind of bring it to everyone else as well. So I did choose that on purpose, and I think that's a great first question, and I have not been asked that.
So I will say that you and I talked about before we hit record, before we went live,
Mhm.
uh, that there's a specific chapter about polarization that I think we could have
Mhm.
the whole conversation about here, and it's one of the things I try to find, or usually it finds me in every book I read or every one of these conversations I have, the thing that will stick with me. And it's
Mhm.
that chapter that will probably stick with me the most. And the reason I'm saying that now is obviously to compliment you, but beyond that, to say, I don't know for all of you who are listening that we'll even get there in this conversation, because we do need to get at the teaminess stuff, that high end of the groupiness stuff, as you mentioned. And so we may not get there, but there are great things in this book that do go beyond maybe the tactical or even strategic that we need to be thinking about as relates to this show. So that's where we're going to go. But I do think There's one other thing we need to do before we go start to dive in, and that is, and you talk about this at some length, especially in Western culture. We have this belief that there are these lone geniuses, that they magically make things happen out of air, and that certainly is true. It's far less true than we believe it to be. So,
Mhm.
like, let's talk about what I think you call it the lone genius myth. Talk about that just a little bit, because if we're gonna be effective as leaders of teams and groups, we need to be clear about this ourselves and help our teams with it as well.
Yeah. So the myth of the lone genius is this idea that when we look back at history and we try and explain it, we tend to focus on these great individuals. That we're trying to tell the story of Steve Jobs or of Einstein or of whatever. Pick the sort of lone genius that you look up to the most. And there's good reasons, if we understand our own psychology, that we want to do that. First, it's easier for us to relate to, right? That we live our lives as individuals, and so it's easy for us to kind of relate to a story that's about someone else who's experiencing the world as an individual. But it's also because of what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, and it's called fundamental because this is at the basis of so many of the cognitive mistakes that we make. And that what we do is, when we're trying to explain why someone else does something, we tend to use their traits, their personality, things about them as an individual to understand, why were you late? Why did you say that thing I found, vaguely insulting? Well, it must be because, you're lazy or you're rude. And that those are the kinds of explanations that, especially when we're not thinking very hard, that we use. And we systematically underweight the situation and the context that these things are happening in. And that part of that, for whatever reason, we look at groups as a big part of that context. And so, in the book, I kind of peel back some of these lone genius myths. I look at the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA. I talk about Thomas Edison, and we sort of, peel back the layers. And whatever story you pick, when you peel back those layers, you're going to find a great group right behind that, seemingly lone genius. And so I think if we're trying to manage for, people to do great things, then we need to understand that it's those great groups we're trying to create. We're not just trying to find the next genius. That's not really how these things happen. And that there's a lot of great data that shows that on average, that these sort of lone geniuses, that individual discoveries, individual businesses, individual patents, those are happening less and less, and they're less and less impactful. That in today's world, groups and teams are the ones who are disproportionately making all the big discoveries, starting all the great businesses, making the changes in the world that we want to see. So I think
Yeah,
it's really important to unpack that.
yeah, there's some really cool examples in the book about all that. I think, along with some of the stuff that I said that I will take from this book around polarization and understanding it better. The other, I think, big thing for me was the stuff around synergy. So I'd like to talk about the science of synergy a little bit, because, as you note in the book, a lot of times people like you and I will use that word, and others, I think, sometimes kind of roll their eyes about that. And so let's talk about the science underneath that sort of very cool, trendy, and maybe cliche word.
Yeah, synergy. I really thought long and hard about, like, do I want to use this word, because I do think it's got, it's almost the like most cliche business buzzword you could use on some level, right? Like in a in a movie, if they're trying to make fun of business people, they're probably going to have them talking about synergy or something. But when you study groups, synergy is real, and it's sort of the magic sauce that we're looking for all the time. If we just split everybody up and we had a team, and instead of having them work together, everyone was working alone as an individual, and we add up what they did, is that going to be more or less than if we had them work as a real team? And that's always the question, because that's a real question if you're a manager, right? Should I
Absolutely.
split people up, or should I have them work together? And that for years, it proved to be really hard to find. That when researchers were studying this, they kept finding that groups underperformed that bar. That when you bring people together, they're less than the sum of their parts, literally. That if you just had them split up and do things individually and added it all together, whether they were, pulling a rope or cheering or, stuffing envelopes or even brainstorming, coming up with ideas, we keep finding what researchers called process losses, that they were literally less than the sum of their parts. But that doesn't need to be the case. And the science of synergy has told us that we can predict the times that it's most likely where groups are going to be more than the sum of their parts. And so that's really what I think this science has done, is made more sophisticated comparisons between individual performance, group performance, and the sort of hypothetical, what would the best individuals do, what would the fastest individuals do, what would the most efficient individuals do, and how does the group compare to those things. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of breakthroughs.
So anyone who's listening now says, okay, what are some of those times? So give us a couple things to help us as leaders understand, recognize, be aware of those moments when the process gains outpace the process losses.
So the times when synergy is most likely are when things are complex. So that's the number one predictor, is when you give teams a complex task, they have a lot better chance of outperforming individuals than they do. They have a lot better chance of outperforming the best individual, the fastest individual, all these things. And that by complex, I simply mean there's too much for individuals to keep track of. That when there's 18 different choices and 18 different contingencies and a whole bunch of rules, that then groups are going to tend to perform better than individuals. But that it's beyond that, and that a lot of these important tasks, whether it's starting a business, whether it's engineering some new product, they require more expertise and more diverse expertise than any one person has. And that there's a lot of these tasks, like playing in a jazz ensemble, where you literally couldn't do it alone, right? There's no way. Like
I can't play the
sort of,
saxophone and the trumpet at the same time.
That's right. That's right. You can't play the trumpet and the saxophone, so we need this whole band. And that's, again, an opportunity for synergy. But moreover, if we kind of take that metaphor further, we tend not to like bands that are all the same instrument. The chances that your favorite band is a saxophone ensemble of 6 saxophone players is quite low. I mean, there's some great ones, don't get me wrong. My friends, if any of my saxophone ensemble friends are watching, no offense, but they're we like that diversity of skills in our groups, and the same's true at work. That when we set teams up where not everybody knows the same stuff, not everybody's bringing the same skills to the table, that's when we have a chance of synergy. And so we're giving them complicated work, stuff that hopefully no one knows the answer to already, and that this kind of is the flip side of that, right? That the time where you have the worst chance of synergy is where we already know how to do the task really, really well, that we could do it as individuals. We don't need to have a group here. I could go home and I could do it on my own. And that it's got this kind of repetitive quality where the process is really prescribed for us. So somebody else has told us, you've got to do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. You can't deviate from that. And those tend to be things that groups don't have a great chance of synergy at.
And yet everyone who's listening will say, well, we've done that. And sometimes we do that in the name of inclusion, or in the name of, we think it's going to create engagement. It's one of the reasons why we end up with meetings that have way more people in them than we need to have in them. And I know you and I could go way down that path. I want to ask you, everyone who's listening is, and I said it in the open, is on teams, leads teams, has lots of team experience, some good, some not so good. What is it, would you say, from the breadth of your research, what is the thing that people most often get wrong about teams?
Oh boy, there's so many things. So
Well,
many
give us
things
a
to choose
couple.
from
Yeah,
that.
I
Yeah.
know, I know. I hate it when
Yeah.
people ask me
Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
call the desert island question.
Yeah.
I can go to the desert island and I can only take one album with me. I know which one you'd take because I read
Yeah.
the book.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, I know getting it to one is hard. Um, but what are a couple of the big
Mhm.
ones that have a huge negative impact on our
Mhm.
success?
Yeah. I mean, I think you were alluding to one of the biggest ones right there, which is this kind of groups as a vehicle for, including everybody in, a decision, or feeling like we don't want to leave people out of these meetings because, that they would feel bad, but instead that we just group meetings shouldn't have more than about 7 people in them, and they just
Say that
that we
again. Everyone
yeah.
needs to know this.
Yeah.
I mean, and you may know it, but you don't do it. Say that one
Yep,
more time,
that's right.
Colin.
So group meetings shouldn't have more than 7 people in them. That if you've got more than 7 people, your chances of everybody feeling heard, everybody feeling like they're contributing, even if you invited them because you wanted to include them, the chances that they're going to feel that way are really, really low. That we know if we enter a room and there's 20 people sitting around a table and we've got an hour-long meeting, you're not going to be heard. You're not going to really have a real discussion where we, come to new ideas. That's just, it's not possible. That some people are just going to sit there and be silent and not say anything, or it's going to be trivial. And that, the research really bears this one out. And I would say this is where I get into the most combative, not combative, but I
Yeah,
think
maybe.
everybody, like when I tell, managers this, it's not that people don't believe it. It's just they don't know what to do with that, because it seems so impossible to then go, wait a minute, I'm supposed to only have meetings with, 3 to 7 people in them all the time. And that, all these kind of all hands meetings where I've got 20, 30 people, I'm supposed to just like not do those and tell people not to come. And the answer is, yeah, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. Um,
Think about
and
how much.
yeah,
Listen,
yeah.
everybody. Think about how much time. Bad word, I suppose. Man hours you get back in your organization if you simply did that one thing. You're welcome,
Mhm.
everybody,
Yeah.
because that is massive. And even when we had our leader hat on, we say, I don't know how to do that. We've all been in those meetings with our leader hat not on, and we know that Colin is exactly right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
it's so tough. Yeah.
I absolutely, I know it's tough. So let's talk about launching teams, because everyone who's watching or listening, it is or will have the opportunity to launch a new team, a project team, or whatever, or building a brand new team, whatever. What are a couple of things that we should be doing, and maybe things we don't know we should be doing when we're launching or forming teams, so they can be more effective more quickly?
The most important thing is something I hope you should do, even if you forget, which is to be clear about what the goal of this team is. Why did we get these people together? What are we supposed to achieve? Where are we go? Where are we trying to get to? And that too often, where I think people make a mistake, is they assume that everybody knows why they were invited. They assume that it's like, oh, it's like you must have, read all the materials, or you heard from somebody else, or somebody else told you, and so we can just get right to work. So right at the beginning, and even before the beginning, right, when you're sending out the materials for the meeting, when you're whatever communication there is, you're saying, here's what we're trying to achieve. Here's where we're trying to get to. Here's why it's important. That this is important to us as an organization. It's important to the world to do. It's important to, me personally. And then the third thing, and this is where I think people skip it, is why is this going to be challenging? And this gets back to what we were just talking about with when should you even have a group that has a chance of synergy? And it's when we're doing something complicated, something challenging, that's going to require us to really use the full complement of our knowledge, skills, and effort. And if we don't feel like it's going to be challenging, that's when you get people who are going to be disengaged and kind of check out. So these are the kind of three buckets or three check marks you're trying to hit when you're articulating the goal. That it's clear what it is, it's clear why it's important, and you're articulating what's going to be challenging about it and why we're going to need a team to do it. So I think that's the one that I think hopefully you kind of know that, but that it gets forgotten too often.
And you said the right word. We assume the leader thinks, well, surely everyone knows this. Just because you've said it in your head 60 times does not mean you've even said it out loud once, let alone enough times for people to get it without question. There's so much, Colin, that we could talk about. I want to talk a little bit about competition, because, and this might be an area that the reason that I want to talk about it is because I found myself nodding in agreement with you throughout that section. But let's talk about competition, because we seem to have a bit of a love-hate tension about it. Like, well, yeah, we sort of know competition can be good, but like we've all seen where competition causes problems on a team. So how do we keep or make competition healthy for our teams and groups?
Yeah, it's a great question, because competition is one of the most powerful motivators that we know about. That if you want people to be, work really, really hard, putting them in a competition where they think they have a chance to win, that's gonna work. Now, the problem, it's gonna, if what we want is for people to work hard, but that working hard isn't always the same thing as healthy. And so I like the way you phrase that here, is making competition healthy, and that there's a couple things that we might get confused about. One is competition within the team is very difficult to make healthy. That when you have members that are competing against one another for rewards, for promotions, for just the goodwill of the boss, that may motivate individuals, but it's going to make it less likely that when they need to help each other, they need to support each other, they need to be teaching one another things, that it's making it less likely that they're going to do it. And so
Process losses are going to grow here, to go back
yes,
to our
that's right.
earlier conversation.
That's right. And that although we all kind of idolize these high profile situations, like NFL training camp just ended for a lot of people, right? And there's competition between team members to make the team, to start, and all those things, and we've all probably been a part of groups that had that character to them. But that sports are only a good metaphor for other kinds of organizations some of the time.
Yeah, they're only a good metaphor until they're not.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. And that sports have a lot of things going for them that we don't have in organizations, right? They have these really well-defined tasks. They've got work that almost is inherently already motivating, and that when we're in the world of business, usually we're doing stuff that's much more ambiguous and confusing. The tasks aren't that well defined. The scorecard isn't there for us. We can't tell if we're doing well or not as we're doing the work, especially when we're doing something new. And so in those situations, competition is not very helpful. That the less well we know what it is we're doing, the less competition's likely to help. Because when we get stressed, we tend to do things that are familiar. Our brain actually travels familiar pathways when we have, whether it's good stress or bad stress, and that competition is kind of a potentially good stressor. Um, but when we need to make new connections, to learn something new, to be creative or innovative, then these kinds of stressors work against us. They work against our brain, and they work against our social connections within the group. So the best way to have healthy competition is to benchmark the team against itself, to say, let's compete against ourselves yesterday. Let's do better than we did last week, last month, last year. And that if we're constantly competing against these past versions of ourselves, that's where we tend to see the healthiest competition. Now, if you do have a rival out there in the business world, if you work at Coke and you're against Pepsi, and you sort of say, hey, let's beat Pepsi, that's not such a terrible thing. But
But what
sometimes
happens
yeah,
is a lot of times is we
yeah.
end up saying, well, we want to beat the second shift, or we want to beat, I mean, all of the conversation we could all have about silos in
Mhm.
organizations ultimately end up being putting the competition in the wrong place by
Right.
competing against the other departments and trying to win that way. We're sub-optimizing the system, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and you're absolutely right. I've seen especially a lot of big organizations where there's a ton of different metrics, and that people are competing for resources, and those resources are more of their everyday experience. That we end up competing absolutely against the wrong people. So healthy, if you're managing with competition and trying to motivate people that way, the more you can get us focused on being a better version of ourselves, the better off you're going to be.
And ourselves being us, not
Yes.
me personally.
Right.
So I don't know that, as the person who co-wrote books called The Long Distance Leader and The Long Distance Team and The Long Distance Teammate for that matter,
Mhm.
um, we have to talk a little bit about remote,
Yeah.
hybrid,
Great.
virtual, call it whatever you want to
Mhm.
call it, because the highest level of groupiness, to use your word from
Mhm.
earlier, is when we are face to face. We
Mhm.
are we are together in a synchronous manner, at
Mhm.
least some of the time, and that's not necessarily our situations now. And so
Mhm.
my question for you is if you're talking to a leader whose team is remote or hybrid in some way, shape, or form, and I know there's all manner of what that could look like,
Mhm.
based on what you know and what the research tells us, what are a couple of things we ought to be keeping in mind to help our teams be more successful?
So yeah, this is up there with a question I get asked a lot, and I'm glad we're talking about it. And I think there's a couple of things we need to be really clear about in our own heads. So when we say remote and we say hybrid, that we could mean a couple of different things. So if what we mean is sometimes we're not having people come into the office and we're all meeting virtually. Okay. And sometimes we're in the office. Okay. That I think is fine. It creates new challenges, certainly. But that, when we have the ability to involve people from different geographical locations, we should theoretically be able to get people, with more precisely the right kind of expertise, the right information, different perspectives. That should be good. Right. Now, so there's a lot of advantages that we have from being able to communicate in these different ways. But as you say, we evolved to read a lot of each other's nonverbal cues to get a lot out of being in person, and that's information that we don't get nearly as efficiently when we're meeting over these kind of different sorts of Zoom or technological mediated platforms, whatever they might be.
Mhm.
And so we do that creates what psychologists call psychological distance, which is basically just what it sounds like, that I see you as more distant from myself than I otherwise would if we were face to face.
And that in itself is super important because it's more than just physical distance, right?
Yeah,
It's a
that's
really
right.
important point.
Yeah. No, and it's, that psychological distance is absolutely heightened when we're over Zoom. That even if, I'm Zooming with the person in the office next door, there's still more psychological distance meeting this way. And so if you're a leader who's leading a lot of these kind of virtual team meetings, you need to be conscious of that and try and overcome it. That we didn't get to make small talk on the walk over to the meeting or right before or right after. That we can't sort of read some of these nonverbal cues that might help us understand, what other people are thinking and feeling. And that means one, we may need to ask, and that's a kind of easy fix if you are less confident that you know what everybody else is thinking and feeling. A great way to find out is to ask and make that part of the meeting. And then sometimes I've seen a lot of teams do really creative things to make sure that they can see each other as more human without it taking up half of the meeting. And I think this is the challenge, right? If we all go along and we do a status check and say everything that's going on in our lives, everything takes a little longer in these virtual meetings. So that's really tough. But I've seen some teams where they rotate who does that, and there's kind of a little show and tell, or it's Kevin's turn this time to say, here's what's going on in my life, or there's some kind of like open mic for 3 minutes at the beginning. So there's creative ways you can do that, and I don't think I don't want to be in the business of saying like there's one way that works better than all the other ways, because I think all this is a moving target as we get more comfortable with these technologies, as these technologies themselves change and the fidelity of them change. So I think just, being conscious of that, trying to do temperature checks, and to be, make sure that everybody is remembering there's other humans on the other end of this. But when we say hybrid, I do want to, put a note of caution there, because sometimes we confuse hybrid work, that sometimes we're in the office, sometimes we're not, with hybrid meetings, where some people are physically present and some people are online. Hybrid work, generally, research has shown that's good. Hybrid meetings, where some people are online, some people are in person, research is much more pessimistic about those.
And
And
very
so,
focused on the skill of the facilitator to
yeah,
help make
yeah.
it better or not.
You're making your job harder, that essentially, that when you have a hybrid meeting, you're probably disadvantaging some subgroup. It's probably the online group relative to the people who are in person. Um, and that the chances that like people don't feel included or heard, even though they're present at the meeting, go
Goes up.
way up. Information sharing's worse, and that it's harder for groups to develop norms, especially when who's online and who's in person keeps changing, which in a lot of groups it does. When you have this norm, it's okay to meet that way.
Yep.
And so groups just don't get going at the same rate as even a group that always met virtually. And so if you
Yep.
feel like you're having these hybrid meetings and you're struggling, I would much rather you say, okay, everybody just grab a computer, let's all be online, and we're going to figure it out that way, rather than having these two different communication media going on at the same time. And that's where groups have been seen to struggle the most.
Yeah, I completely agree, both from our team's personal experience as well as our work with clients as well. I agree with that 100%. A couple things before we go, Colin. I said before, and we were talking with Colin Fisher, the author of The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. And we'll let him tell us a little bit about where we can get that and all those things in a second. But a couple of other questions, Colin, before we go. And the first one of which is, what do you do for fun besides play jazz?
Besides play jazz, boy, I don't have that many hobbies outside. I didn't know you were going to take jazz away
Well, I
from
didn't
me in
either
that
until
one.
right in
Yeah,
that instant, because I thought we've already covered that. And
yeah,
if you're watching, everybody, you can see the piano in the background. First time I've had a guest, 500 guests with a piano, first piano in the background. But anyway,
yeah.
anything other than jazz, playing and listening to jazz that you would say is in that fun list?
I've taken up one of the national pastimes here in the UK. So I'm based in London now, despite the accent. And that one of my favorite things to do is walk around London. So I eschew buses. I try not to take them very often, and London's actually not as huge as you might think. So I walk and I hike, and I try and see new places around here, find new restaurants. So that's definitely if I'm not playing music, maybe I'm hiking to a jam session or hiking to somewhere that I can play music, but I definitely like to walk around now.
The next question is, what are you reading these days, Colin?
Yeah, so many things at this point. There's so many great books going on. The two, I will say, one I probably should have read a long time ago, which is Toni Morrison's Beloved. So I finally have picked that up. I'm probably not quite far enough into it to really give a huge synopsis of what's actually happening, because it is a book where it's kind of hard to figure out what's happening a lot of the time. Magical realism's is tricky. And then my son is getting ready to do his college applications right now, and he's writing about this book by Carlo Rovelli called Helgoland, which is sort of about this relational theory of quantum physics, but it's really clearly explained. So I'm trying to stay with him and understand what he's talking about when he's trying to write his personal statement by also reading this book. Not sure I'm achieving it though.
Holy smokes. Reading that kind of a book for your college application, I don't know
It's different
that
here,
I
man.
would be able to stay with it even as well as you're staying with it. Colin, how can we learn more? Where do you want to point people? How can they connect with you? What do you want to say about that? For those watching, I'll hold the book up while Colin does that.
So one stop shop, colinmfisher.com, and that'll have where you can get the book no matter where you are in the world. It'll have my newsletter and my socials and all the great stuff that I undoubtedly will be up to.
colinmfisher.com. And so now a question for all of you who have been listening. And it's the question I ask you every single episode. And it's simply this: now what? What action will you take as a result of this? Listen, I know you're on teams. And listen, I know you likely lead at least one, if not many teams. So there's plenty that you could take from this conversation. And I'm not going to presume what it should be, but I am going to urge you, though, is to take action on whatever that is, so that you got an insight. You need to translate the insight into action. And when you do that, good things will come for you and the teams that you're a part of. I hope that you will do that. Colin, thanks so much for being here. I was really looking forward to this conversation, and I appreciate not only our time today and your insights, but also this great book that you wrote.
Oh, thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks for having me. Thanks for all of you for checking in here.
And so, everybody, that's the conclusion of another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, which means three things. Number one, make sure you come back. And to make sure you come back, it means that you need to make sure you're subscribed wherever you watched or listened so you don't miss any future episodes. And one more thing, invite someone else to join you next week, or invite them to watch the show or listen to the show that you just listened to, because when you do that, it helps all of us get better. It helps all of us get smarter, and it helps put a smile on Kevin's face. Come back next week, if you would, for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.